Back in the day, the ancient world quaked at the sound of marching armies, and of all empires, Assyria was the most feared. It was a time marked by conquests, with kings who were both warriors and rulers. Assyria, a relentless superpower, stretched its voracious tentacles across the lands, swallowing city after city with chilling efficiency. Judah, fertile and strategically placed, often found itself overshadowed by these warlike giants. The people of Judah lived in constant alert, aware that at any moment, the tide of war could turn against them. With their rich traditions and deep faith in God, they cherished peace, but the reality of their geography perpetually skirted the edge of war. In these turbulent times, the hearts of the men and women of Judah were tested. The air was heavy with grim expectations as news of Assyrian atrocities spread like a chilling wind. Stories were told of cities reduced to ashes, once green fields now stained with the blood of the fallen, and entire populations carried off to exile, their lives torn apart by the Assyrian war machine. In Jerusalem, people looked to the sky, praying that the same fate would not befall them. Every family, every soldier, every leader knew that their nation's survival depended not just on walls and swords, but on the faith and courage that sustained their spirits. In this shadowy, fearful setting, King Hezekiah, a man of unwavering faith and clear vision, took up the task of guiding his people. He sought not only to strengthen the city's defenses and boost the morale of his people but also clung to the promise of his God, who had delivered his predecessors and promised protection to those who remained loyal. As the shadows of war drew closer, the flames of hope and determination burned brightly in the hearts of those in Jerusalem, ready to face whatever came, armed with faith and the promise of a power far greater than any earthly army could muster. Amid the upheavals and fears of a kingdom besieged by ravenous empires, Hezekiah ascended to the throne of Judah, his faith and courage shining like beacons in the night of despair. From the start of his reign, Hezekiah showed ironclad determination to restore Judah to a spiritual purity long forgotten. With a passion burning stronger than the forges of his blacksmiths, he began radical reforms, dismantling pagan altars that dotted the landscape as remnants of a compromised faith. The high places, where incense to foreign gods polluted the skies of Judah, were torn down under his command. Asherah poles were cut down, and bronze idols crushed under the relentless weight of his devotion to God. Hezekiah's reforms were not just physical, they were a revival of the spirit and soul of his people. He unlocked the doors of the temple, which had been sealed by his father, and purified its halls with the help of priests and Levites whom he had restored to their honored positions. With sacred oils, prayers, and hymns, the temple was rededicated to the service of God. There, in the heart of Jerusalem, Hezekiah reinstated the celebration of Passover, bringing his people together not just in ritual observance, but in a communion of hearts and spirits that transcended the temple walls. Hezekiah ruled not just with decrees and reforms, he led by example. His devotion to God wasn't a facade to appease the clergy or curry favor with the devout. It was a genuine expression of his faith, a faith that led him to kneel in prayer during the darkest hours, seeking divine guidance and protection not just for himself, but for all his people. The revitalization under Hezekiah wasn't a flame that burned alone in the royal palace. It was a fire that spread throughout all the towns and villages of Judah. With every altar restored, every idol overthrown, and every festival renewed, hope returned to the hearts of his people. They saw in their king a leader who not only promised salvation but worked tirelessly to manifest it. In Hezekiah, they found not just a ruler but a renewer of faith, a shield against the darkness that threatened to engulf their land and traditions. Thus, in a time of great distress, Hezekiah's leadership became the anchor for a people desperately seeking something to hold on to. This restored union of king and faith prepared Judah for the formidable challenges that lay ahead, strengthening the resilience of a kingdom beset by enemies but blessed with revived faith. As Hezekiah fortified the foundations of faith in Judah, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. From the north, a growing roar echoed across the lands, the advance of the Assyrian army, a tide of iron and fire under the command of the ruthless king Sennacherib. With a hardened heart and inflamed ambition, Sennacherib moved like a devastating storm, with the clear purpose of subduing all nations under his brutal dominion. The cities of Judah, one after another, trembled and fell under the weight of this relentless advance. Lachish, one of Judah's strongholds, found itself surrounded by legions of Assyrian soldiers. Siege engines, monstrous constructs of wood and metal, rose against the walls as the war cries of the Assyrians filled the air, mingling with the terrifying sound of metal against stone. The defenders of Lachish fought with fierce desperation, but each hurled stone and each launched arrow only delayed the inevitable. The terror that accompanied the Assyrian army was not merely a product of its military strength but also of its strategic cruelty. Sennacherib didn't just conquer, he disfigured the human and cultural landscape of every region he subdued, taking captives, plundering temples, and leaving behind a visible trail of desolation and despair. The impact of his march was both physical and psychological, a calculated display meant to sow terror in the heart of anyone who dared resist. As news of these conquests and brutality reached Jerusalem, the hearts of every man, woman, and child were heavy with a mix of fear and resolve. Prayers intensified, and Hezekiah summoned his people to maintain their faith, even as the shadow of the enemy loomed over their own walls. Hezekiah, facing the greatest trial of his reign, knew that his next decisions could seal the fate of his people. Faced with Sennacherib's demand for total submission, a choice presented itself: submit to the Assyrian yoke and lose the freedom and faith he had fought so hard to restore, or resist and face the wrath of one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. In those dark days, as the fate of Judah hung in the balance, Hezekiah's determination to trust in divine protection would be tested to its limit. The Assyrian threat was not just a military crisis, it was a spiritual challenge, a clash between the power of arms and the strength of faith. As the shadows of the Assyrian armies covered the land, the fate of Jerusalem seemed sealed. Sennacherib's forces, driven by past victories, arrived at the gates of Jerusalem with the cruel certainty of those who had never known defeat. The city, the pulsating heart of Judah, vibrated with a mix of devotion and despair, as every man, woman, and child awaited the siege that could erase their history and their faith. Within the walls, Hezekiah faced the ultimate test of his reign. The king, whose faith had been the compass of his reforms, now mobilized not just soldiers, but also hearts and spirits, preparing his city both spiritually and physically. The walls were fortified, water sources blocked from the outside to prevent the enemy from using them, and war preparations were accompanied by prayers and sacred rituals, each step marked by the hope for a miracle. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the ground trembled under the weight of the Assyrian siege engines. Imposing towers rose, attempting to reach the skies of Jerusalem, while colossal battering rams struck the gates like the beats of an enraged giant. The sound was deafening, a symphony of destruction that sought to break not just stone, but the very will of a people. Sennacherib, in his arrogance, sent messengers who cried out to the defenders on the walls, mocking their faith and proclaiming the futility of their resistance. They painted pictures of despair and ruin, promising mercy in exchange for submission, but implying in their undertones the certainty of captivity and dishonor. But Jerusalem was no ordinary city. It was a city consecrated by promises and prophecies, a home that had seen kings and prophets walk its streets and pray in its temples. Under the leadership of Hezekiah, and guided by the prophet Isaiah, the city responded not with words of fear, but with a determined silence, a silence that spoke of unwavering trust in a power greater than any earthly army. In the streets of Jerusalem, families gathered, hands joined in prayer, while soldiers on the walls prepared their weapons. Each heart beat with the strength of faith, and every gaze toward the horizon kept the flame of hope alive, even as the darkness of the besieged night promised a dawn of trials. During those days of siege, Jerusalem became more than just a city. It became a symbol of resistance, a bastion of faith where every stone and every prayer intertwined, forming a fortress as impenetrable as the promises of a God who had never forsaken his people. As the shadows of the siege closed in on Jerusalem and the roar of the Assyrian armies echoed against its walls, Hezekiah's heart remained steadfast, anchored not in stone or steel, but in his unchangeable faith in his God. In a world where many kings would succumb to despair or fear, Hezekiah chose a different path, one paved with prayer and divine trust. Inside the Temple of Jerusalem, under the soft glow of oil lamps, Hezekiah knelt with an urgency that transcended fear. His prayers were not mere whispers of desire, but fervent pleas for salvation, a direct communication with the Creator he knew was listening to every word. The king, dressed not in golden ornaments but in the simple mantle of humility, sought not just the preservation of his kingdom, but the reaffirmation of the covenant between his people and their God. Around him, the priests and the faithful gathered, forming a chorus of voices that rose above the external threats. They were hymns of hope and declarations of faith, which resonated through the stone arcades of the temple, filling the sacred space with a strength that seemed capable of repelling the very walls of adversity. Hezekiah did not keep this faith to himself, he shared it openly, strengthening the spirit of his people. At the city walls, where soldiers prepared for what might be their final battle, Hezekiah spoke with a conviction that transformed fear into fortitude. He reminded everyone that the battle was not just against shields and swords, but against despair and doubt. "Do not fear or be dismayed because of this great army," he proclaimed, "for the battle is not yours, but God's." His words were not just meant to encourage, but to remind every man and woman that the history of their people was filled with moments when the impossible had been made possible by the hand of God. And as night fell and the shadows lengthened, Hezekiah continued his vigil of prayer, not on a secluded throne, but among his people, sharing both their anguish and their hope. This unity, this shared faith amidst the siege, wove an invisible tapestry of collective strength, a spiritual shield as powerful as any physical fortification. Amidst the turmoil of the siege and the threat of destruction, Hezekiah's faith shone like a beacon, guiding his people not just in the hope of survival but in the deep certainty that they were protected, guided, and loved by a force greater than any army they could face. As the shadows of desolation spread over Jerusalem and hope seemed but a flickering flame before the Assyrian storm, a man walked with a certainty that defied the surrounding darkness. Isaiah, the prophet, whose voice had echoed through the hills and valleys of Judah, now brought a message that was both a promise and a divine proclamation. With the gates of Jerusalem closed and the walls watched by 10 sentinels, Isaiah found Hezekiah, who waited with the expectation of a leader aware of the weight of destiny. The king's eyes, marked by vigil and prayer, met those of the prophet, and in his gaze, there was a silent plea for a word that could transform fear into faith. Isaiah, whose face was lit not only by the fervor of his mission but by the palpable presence of the Spirit guiding him, spoke with a voice that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "Thus says the Lord," he began, his words ringing clear and unequivocal, "Do not fear the words you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me." The square in front of the temple, where the leaders and the people gathered, filled with an expectant silence. Each word from Isaiah wove a carpet of hope under the feet of his listeners. "Behold, I will put a spirit in him, and he shall hear a rumor, and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land." The promise was clear and direct: Jerusalem would not fall into the hands of the Assyrians. More than that, it was an affirmation that the city was under the protection of the Most High, that the plans of men were nothing before the divine will. Isaiah spoke of an intervention not just physical but spiritual, a battle being waged in the heavens as men prepared to defend their walls. Hezekiah, hearing the words of the prophet, felt the weight of uncertainty dissipate like mist under the morning sun. Isaiah's confirmation was not just a comfort, it was a call to maintain the faith he had defended and spread among his people. The prophetic words reinforced his resolve and reignited the courage in his warriors and citizens, who now saw in each defense preparation not despair, but the certainty of the promised victory. Thus, as night fell over Jerusalem, a new light shone within its walls. It was the light of renewed faith, the certainty that each prayer, each vigil, was not in vain. With Isaiah's prophetic intervention, Jerusalem was not just preparing to face the siege but did so with the serenity of those already guarded by divine hands, imbued with a strength that no earthly army could surpass. In the darkness of that fateful night, as Jerusalem remained enclosed by walls that seemed so fragile in the face of the imminent Assyrian assault, a strange and profound calm settled over the city. The inhabitants, aware of the danger surrounding them, found themselves in a state of tranquil vigil, their prayers and hopes intertwined in a silence that pulsed with the promise of divine intervention. Outside the walls, the vast Assyrian camp stretched like a dark stain under the pale moon. Armed men, war machines, horses, and tents formed a panorama of power and threat, the breath of a sleeping giant that promised destruction at dawn. In the heart of this military leviathan, Sennacherib, the proud Assyrian king, rested in his tent, his dreams populated with conquests and triumphs. However, the sky above the camp began to pulse with a presence that was not of this world. A subtle light, almost imperceptible, began to descend, gentle as the night breeze but laden with the weight of the divine. It was the angel of the Lord, sent as the executor of a heavenly decree, a direct answer to the fervent prayers of a king and his people. With silent speed, the angel moved among the ranks of the Assyrian soldiers. There was no clamor of battle, nor clash of swords, just a breath of death that touched each man where he lay. The soldiers, who hours before mocked the impotence of Jerusalem, now met an end as abrupt as it was inexplicable. One after another, they fell, not by sword or arrow, but by the intangible and lethal touch of the celestial messenger. As the angel's light traveled through the camp, each tent became a silent tomb. Battle plans, siege strategies, all became irrelevant in the face of the power now manifesting. Sennacherib, awakening from his dreams of glory, emerged to find his army devastated, a force that seemed invincible at sunset reduced to shadows and silence by dawn. Meanwhile, inside Jerusalem, a feeling of awe and reverence took hold of those who watched. Hezekiah, upon hearing the first reports from incredulous sentinels, knew that the promises made through Isaiah had been fulfilled. Not by human hands, but by the direct intervention of God, Jerusalem was saved, not just preserved from destruction but elevated as a witness to the supreme and undeniable power of the Creator. That night, marked by divine action, would remain etched in the memories and songs of Jerusalem for generations, an everlasting testament that even in the darkest hours, the light of faith and the hand of God can bring salvation and renewal. As the first light of dawn tinged the sky above Jerusalem, the initial rays of sun unveiled a miracle so profound and unexpected that it seemed as though time itself had paused. As the city awoke, a sense of awe and disbelief took hold of every heart. The prayers from the night before, heavy with fears and pleas for mercy, had been answered in a way that transcended human understanding. The guards on the walls, who had spent the night in a tense vigil, anticipating at any moment the crash of battering rams against the gates or the war cries of the Assyrians, were the first to witness the miracle. Where once there was a sea of tents and the daunting presence of an army poised for battle, now lay only silence and desolation. The vast Assyrian army, which had camped with the certainty of imminent victory, had been decimated without a single scream, without the clash of swords, with nothing but the silent and devastating intervention of a divine power. The news spread quickly through Jerusalem, from mouth to mouth, from house to house. Men, women, and children emerged from their dwellings, some running to the walls to see with their own eyes, others kneeling at their doors, raising their hands to the sky in gratitude. Hezekiah, the king whose faith had been the flame burning amidst the darkness of despair, walked among his people, sharing in their astonishment and celebration. The expressions of awe on the citizens' faces reflected a mix of relief and reverence. They looked beyond the walls, no longer fearing what they would find, but marveling at the display of God's power. The enemy tents were abandoned, and the siege equipment, once symbols of impending death, now seemed like relics of a nightmare dispersed by the light of dawn. This moment was not just one of victory, it was a renewal of faith. Every whisper of wind, every ray of sun seemed to carry the message that, even in the most desperate circumstances, divine providence could reverse fate and bring salvation. Jerusalem had not only survived, it had been chosen and protected, a living testament to the love and power of God. That dawn, as the city rose from fear to reaffirmed faith, the echo of praise songs began to fill the air. Hezekiah led his people not just in thanksgiving, but in a renewed commitment to live and govern according to the will of the one who had shown, in such a dramatic and undeniable way, that he was with them. Jerusalem, fortified not by its walls, but by the hand of God, was awakening not to a day of battle, but to an era of hope and deep spiritual certainties. As the sun rose, revealing the extent of the devastation that had befallen his army, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, faced a reality he could never have imagined. The sight before him was one of absolute defeat, not at the hands of a visible army, but by a celestial force whose power he could neither comprehend nor combat. The bodies of his soldiers, who the day before had lain down ready for conquest, now lay motionless, silent witnesses to a divine intervention. With the weight of defeat crushing his pride, Sennacherib was forced to order the retreat of what remained of his forces. The return to Assyria, which should have been a triumphant march laden with spoils and slaves, turned into a funeral procession, a forced exile from a land he believed he would easily subjugate. The journey back was marked not only by mourning for the dead but also by the growing murmur of discontent among the survivors. Every step back home was a reminder of his failure, and Sennacherib's humiliation grew with each mile traveled. The king, once feared and respected for his relentless power, now found himself questioned by his own generals and mocked in secret by his soldiers. The defeat in Jerusalem was not just a military blot, it was an open wound in his claim to divinity, a proof that despite his claims, he was not invulnerable or omnipotent. As he crossed the gates of Nineveh, the capital of his vast empire, Sennacherib faced a public that expected to celebrate victory, but was greeted instead with the desolate sight of a defeated king. The streets, previously prepared for celebrations, echoed with a heavy silence. Whispers among the population and the nobility spoke of a God of Israel more powerful than any deity the Assyrians worshipped, an idea that sowed doubt and fear in the hearts of the people. In the temple of his gods, where Sennacherib sought consolation and guidance, the cold statues seemed to judge him with their stony gazes. The king, who had placed himself as equal to the gods, now found himself humiliated, forced to face the consequences not just of a failed strategy, but of blasphemy against a force he had underestimated. In this moment of profound crisis, Sennacherib was a diminished figure, a king who returned not as a conqueror but as a survivor of a catastrophe that would forever change the perception of his reign. And as he retreated to the darkness of his royal chambers, the echo of his defeat resonated not just through the corridors of Nineveh, but through history, as a testament to the day when the pride of an emperor clashed with the power of a truly all-powerful God. As the shadows of war faded and peace returned to the streets of Jerusalem, the people of Judah found themselves on the threshold of a new era, marked not only by the celebration of a miraculous victory but also by a profound renewal of faith and hope. The divine intervention that had saved their city and people from the clutches of a formidable enemy resonated in every heart, reigniting a love and commitment to their God that transcended words of gratitude and praise. In the weeks and months that followed, Jerusalem was transformed. The temple, the spiritual heart of the city, glowed with a new light. Men, women, and children from all parts of the kingdom came to offer sacrifices of thanksgiving, to pray, and to meditate on the mercy shown to them. The sound of psalms filled the air, a constant melody speaking of divine protection and providence. King Hezekiah, more than ever, emerged as a leader whose own faith had been the catalyst for the manifestation of God's power. He now endeavored not only to rebuild the city's physical walls but to fortify the spiritual life of his people. Reforms that had begun with the purification of worship now deepened, encouraging a return to pure and sincere faith practices, free from the pagan influences that had infiltrated over the years. The community, witness to the strength that their unity and faith could conjure, found new ways to express this shared spirituality. Families, who had clung to each other in times of fear, now celebrated together in times of peace. The bonds that adversity had strengthened now flourished in collaboration and mutual care, weaving a support network that enveloped every member of society. It was also a time for reflection. As they rebuilt their homes and lives, the inhabitants of Jerusalem pondered the lessons of the recent past. They remembered how, even in the darkest moments, they were never truly alone. This awareness fed a new resilience, an understanding that every future challenge could be faced with the same faith that had diverted the course of an invading army. Thus, in an ancient world often marked by conflicts and conquests, the story of Jerusalem stood out as a beacon of hope. It was a story that spoke not only of the strength of its walls or the wisdom of its leaders but of the tireless power of God's love and fidelity. The celebration of this divine protection and the strengthening of the community around their shared faith were now the cornerstones of Judah's identity, a living testament to all nations that in the midst of uncertainty, faith could and should be the compass that guided people through the storms of life. As we witness together the transformative power of faith and the incredible divine protection over Jerusalem, we are reminded that in our own lives, we are not alone in our challenges. Just as God guided and protected Hezekiah and his people, He is present in our moments of need, offering strength and hope. If you are inspired by this story and wish to continue exploring the powerful messages of faith, hope, and renewal found throughout the Holy Book, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Here, we will continue sharing more narratives that enlighten, inspire, and strengthen the soul. Don't miss our upcoming videos. Subscribe now, activate the notification bell to not miss any of our stories, and be part of our community. Together, we will rediscover the rich lessons the Bible has to offer. Thank you for watching, and may you find peace and protection in your journey, just as Jerusalem found under God's guard. Until the next video,